What makes a good infantry unit? We already went over what makes a good archer unit, which is the DPS to be able to shred the opponent's front line. We went over what makes a cavalry unit effective, which is to have good mobility, reasonable sustainability, and decent DPS. And now, when it comes to infantry, I feel like elements of both are necessary for it to be effective. And the other thing with infantry is they have different classes, which we're going to go over as well very soon. So you need to have DPS because you're going to be up and close with your army. You want to shred your opponent's front line, so it has the elements that are needed for an archer. You need to have survivability because you're going to be right on the front lines. There's going to be carnage. There's going to be projectiles shooting at you, and there's going to be hack units as well trying to mow you down. So you're going to need to have good survivability. And you should have reasonable mobility as well, because if your opponent is raiding you, you want your units to be able to respond to raids in a reasonable time. If your units are too slow, then you're going to have trouble, defending raids. And if your units are too slow, then you won't be able to pressure your opponents with infantry as well. One of the cool things about having a good infantry unit is it can raid unimpeded, meaning that if you have 10 Murmillo, you can raid your opponent when he won't be able to stop you with, let's say, his own cavalry, because his own cavalry will probably melt to your infantry units. So infantry are great for raiding as well. Overall, in my opinion, infantry units are the most important units in the game. So before I get started on my tier list, I just want to give a quick shout out to this user right here. He's a viewer of the channel and he saw that I was having trouble with my editing and whatnot, so he actually spent almost an hour of his own time helping me improve the videos going forward. So big shout out to him. You guys can check out his channel. He has a lot of videos as well, it seems like. And I think since we have a small community, Age of Mythology is not like the biggest RTS game out there. We should all support one another so that we can help this scene grow and become better in the future. So in the sense of this tier list, I'm only going to use 4, which is the ones you can see in front of me. Anything that's put into S is going to be units that can instrumentally change the course of the game. Anything that's put in C, it's going to be, you use them only in certain situations if you have to. A is a good unit, and B it's an okay unit. So that's how I'm going to do things. So to start it off, let's look at the units that are anti-cavalry. And I have these 3 picked out right here. They're not in the C tier. I'm just putting it here so we can separate them from the rest. We're going to look at these individually. Now, some of you might ask, why didn't I put the hoplite up there? Maybe the hoplite is also anti-cavalry. However, the hoplite is more of a soft counter to cavalry, whereas these 3 are more of a hard counter to cavalry. The spearman kind of is in a little bit of a state of limbo because it can do a few other functions reasonably well too, but essentially its primary role is to counter cavalry. Okay, so let's take a look at here, which I narrowed it down. Let's start with the herdmen versus the catapeltes. If you look at these side by side, the catapeltes absolutely destroys the herdmen in almost every metric. 5 DPS to 4, same bonus for cavalry, better HP stats. It has more HP per cost and it has better HP overall, better pierce armor as well. The only drawback is it has lower speed. Okay, the catapeltes is 4.5, whereas the herdman is 4.8. Now, if we take this to a game scenario, does this really matter? Well, I would say and argue that not as much. The catapeltes, the Atlanteans in general have the bonus, or their units can garrison into manors. So you can kind of do a little bit better versus raids, and you can kind of stall before your infantry get there in time, right? So you kind of have a little bit of leeway there. If you're Oranos, you also have the sky passages. Whereas the herdman needs to be faster because Norse can't really garrison in their houses, and if they're on the middle of the map and they get raided, these guys need to respond a little bit faster. But in a head-on collision, in a major fight that's happening around the map, the catapeltes is a much better unit overall. If I were to choose, let's say we were in a state where I had unlimited resources and I can make only the anti-cavalry unit that I wanted, I would pick the catapeltes over the herdmen. Also remember that the herdman is cheaper. So if we look at my main spreadsheet right here, and you narrow down to these 2 right here, you can see that the cost difference is the Herdman is 80 resources, whereas the Catapeltes is 95. However, even when you look at the stats, the HP per cost, the Catapeltes is still better than the Herdman. And if you look at this as well, the Herdman takes 14 seconds to create, whereas the Catapeltes takes 11. And on top of that, the Catapeltes, the main issue with the Herdman, rather, let's take a step back, is the Herdman has 4 DPS, whereas the Catapeltes has 5. The issue is if you're not microing properly with your Herdman, your Herdman are going to do a measly 4 damage per second, which is absolutely terrible, in my opinion. So let's say that you have 10 Herdmen and you just A-move them onto your opponent's army. They're only going to be, if they're not attacking cavalry, let's say they're attacking a Hoplite or they're attacking a Frost Giant, it's going to take ages for those Herdmen to kill those units. Whereas this Catapeltes gives you a little bit more leeway in that regard. So there's a clear winner in my books here, and that is the Catapeltes. So we're going to put the Catapeltes in A tier, and we're going to put I'm going to put the Catapeltes in, actually no, A tier. I'm going to put the Herdman in the C tier. Now, as for the Spearmen, let's unhide this. Let's do a comparison between the Herdman and the Spearmen. Which one do we think is better? Now this one, I told you, this is a little bit hard to compare because the Spearman is a little bit lost in limbo. It's not a hard counter to cavalry, but it's not a soft counter either. It's right in between. I personally like the Spearman better than the Herdman because it has 2 extra DPS, so it can be somewhat of a generalist unit, but it can still be extremely good versus cavalry. On top of that, it has 5 speed, so it's a little bit faster. It has a little bit better hack armor, and it has a lot better pierce armor. In terms of its HP per cost, it's slightly lower, so it's going to be 5% lower than the Herdman. Overall, I would definitely take the Spearman over the Herdman. And I would put the Spearman, this is a little bit tricky because I don't know, I think for Egyptian you kind of have no choice but to use them in your main composition because in Age 2 you don't have many other units to play with. So in that sense, I would kind of have to put him in A because Egyptians kind of have to rely on him. However, in the scope, let's say that I had all these options to choose from. Would I pick the Spearman over a Hoplite? Probably not, but this is a little bit tricky, and I'm going to have to put him in actually the B tier. And this is very good. I know this is going to be controversial. Some people are going to have him in the A tier, but in my opinion, he's definitely B tier. Okay, so for the next one here, we're going to be looking at anti-infantry units, and you have three to choose from. You have the Throwing Axeman, you have the Axeman, and you have the Hypaspist. Now, I know that a lot of you guys saw that I put the Throwing Axeman in the range category. However, he kind of functions a little bit of both. It's hard to actually decide which one to put him in because he's tagged as infantry and he's tagged as range. So I put him in both for the sake of comparison. What we're going to do is we're going to open up the Excel spreadsheet. We're going to narrow it down. So we're going to do we're going to hide the ones we don't need. So we're going to hide the Berserk. We're going to hide the Herdman. The Huskarl, we're going to hide him. And let's just hide everything that we don't need. Okay, now we're going to look at a direct comparison between the three. You can see in terms of DPS, the Hypaspist and the Axeman beat out Throwing Axeman, right? Not only the fact that they do a little bit more DPS, but they also do a higher multiplier versus infantry. So in DPS, these two are beating out the Throwing Axeman. However, you have to remember that the Throwing Axeman is a ranged unit, meaning he's going to be able to shoot his projectiles from further away, and as a result, he's going to get more DPS off on his opponent. So, in my opinion, I think this is kind of like a tie. I would say they're all relatively similar. But let's put ourselves in a scenario. Let's say you're going up against Ragnarok. Let's say your opponent had Ragnarok, you're going up against it. Of these three, which one would you use? And I can tell you that I probably wouldn't want to use Throwing Axeman. I would use either one of these two. If I was in a battle between myself and, let's say, a Greek opponent, he was making Hoplites Archers, which one would I want to use? Once again, I think this is going to be controversial, but I still don't think that the Throwing Axeman has that much of advantage there, because it's easier for the Toxicity to actually focus down all the Throwing Axemen if they were in the back line. Whereas if the Hypaspis and the Axeman are in the front line mixed in with other units, it's much harder to target fire onto these units. So I'm going to give it to the Hypaspis and the Axeman here. In terms of the HP per cost, there's a clear winner. It's the Hypaspis. I've said it before in a different video, but the Hypaspis has very good stats overall. Axeman is second, and then Throwing Axeman is last, and that's obviously because it's ranged, so it's going to have a little bit of a trade-off there. I would say that the Hypaspis is a clear winner here. I would say the Axeman and the Throwing Axeman are somewhat tied. In terms of HP, once again, I think it's similar. The Hypaspis is the best clear winner here in my books with 95 HP. Axeman and the Throwing Axeman are kind of the same. I would say, yeah, they're about similar. Pierce armor, Axeman loses. And in terms of the hack armor, the Axeman wins. So here they're kind of a little bit similar. In terms of speed, they're kind of similar as well. Overall, I would say they're very similar, but there's a clear winner in my books, which is the Hypaspis. I think the fact that it has its better tankiness, it's going to allow it to survive on the front lines a lot longer than the Axeman or the Throwing Axeman. The other issue with the Throwing Axeman is the fact that it's double tagged. In Age of Mythology Retold, you have double tagged units, whereas in the original game, you didn't have that. He's an infantry unit, and he's also a ranged unit. So he's going to get countered by cavalry, and he's also going to get countered by archers. So kind of, in my opinion, it kind of sucks a little bit for the Throwing Axeman in this regard. So let's take a look, okay? I think there's a clear winner. It's the Hypaspis. That's my opinion. Now, these two are kind of similar. If I had to choose, I would take the Axeman over the Throwing Axeman. In many games. Some games I would do the opposite, but essentially, these two I think would be kind of similar. I think the Hypaspis, number one for sure. Axeman and Throwing Axeman, you can argue the case for both. Maybe in some games I'll put the Throwing Axeman there. Some games I'll put the Axeman like here. I think overall, I'd probably lean towards, in most scenarios, I'd probably put the Axeman in B tier. But I think, I don't know, this is a close call. Now this is a little bit interesting as well. You have two units that are good versus archers in different ways. You have the Huskarl, which is the Norse anti-archer unit, and then you have a Destroyer, which is an anti-building unit, but it's still pretty decent versus archers. Okay, so let's go on over to our spreadsheet. Let's narrow these down. So we're going to look at actually, why are there still some hidden? Okay, here we go. All right, so we're going to just do the Destroyer, and we're going to do the Huskarl, and we're going to hide everything else that we don't need. And let's do that. Okay. Now, if we're looking at this, and just from a raw DPS standpoint, the Huskarl has the Destroyer beat by a large margin. It's 7 DPS versus 5. Now, in terms of its bonus, it also does 2x versus archers, so it does a multiplier versus archers, whereas the Destroyer doesn't. Where the Destroyer comes out ahead is its survivability. You can see the HP. It's a whopping 150 HP compared to 115. And if you look at the HP per cost, it's 15% better than the Huskarl there too. On top of that, look at its armor. You have 70% pierce armor versus 60. You have 30% hack armor versus 10. Okay, so this one is a really tough comparison because here the DPS, Huskarl wins. HP and survivability, the Destroyer wins. Now speed. The speed, the Huskarl clearly wins as well. Okay, so what would you pick in this scenario if you had to choose? Well, they're kind of different units, right? But they're both good versus ranged. This one here sucks up so much of the damage. So if you're fighting your opponent on a front line, you would want to go the Destroyer. But if you're, moving around the map and, your Huskarls can have the ability to raid because they have so much pierce armor that fortresses, towers, town centers are not going to do much to them. And on top of that, they have 2x multiplier versus archers. So this is kind of a toss-up in my opinion. It's very situational. And I think in most situations, I would take the Huskarl over the Destroyer. Just because it has decent pierce armor, right? 60 versus 70. And it also has good speed and good DPS. So you can just throw it into the fray and it's going to do pretty well overall. You don't have to micro that much with the Huskarl. And it also has the ability to raid. But it's honestly, this one is a little bit of a toss-up. Like, you can argue the destroyer goes here, the Huskar goes here. They're kind of different units, but essentially if we were to compare them head on as a unit that's good versus archers, I would say that I would take the Huskar over the destroyer. Alright guys, so in this section we're going to crown an S tier unit. And these are our generalist units. We have the Hoplite here, we have the Berserk here, and we have the Murmillo here. These ones kind of function as your generalist infantry unit. It's good in most situations against most units. Let's have a look. Okay, so let's pull up Excel here. We have the Berserk, the Hoplite, and the Murmillo. In terms of its DPS, we have a clear winner, which is the Berserk at 9.29. However, the Murmillo is not too far behind, right? It's at 8.75. So not too bad, right? 6%, I think a 6 or 7% difference between the two. These ones don't really have major bonuses or multipliers. They all kind of roughly the same. I mean, the Hoplite has a little bit of a bonus for its cavalry, whereas the Murmillo doesn't, but essentially they're kind of the same. The HP per cost, you can see that the Hoplite wins. The Murmillo wins here by a small little margin, but essentially they're kind of, these two are kind of the same, whereas the Berserk has a lot of trouble in this regard because it's only 85 HP. So it's going to get absolutely shredded on the front lines, right? If you're not very careful with him. He also has lower pierce armor than a Hoplite, which a Murmillo also does as well. Berserk also has lower hack armor than the other two units. But where the Berserk catches up is it has more speed, 4.8 speed versus 4.5 and 4.2. Now, you can kind of see that these two units are kind of opposites in a way. It has the lowest DPS on the Hoplite, but highest DPS on a Berserk. The highest HP on a Hoplite, but the lowest HP on a Berserk, right? So you can kind of see like the speed, highest speed on a Berserk, but the lowest speed on a Hoplite in terms of the generalist units. So which one would you choose between these three? Well, for me, survivability is key on the battlefield, right? Being able to survive on the front lines, that's what an infantry unit is for. And an infantry unit should also have decent DPS, which the Hoplite does. So does the Berserk. So I would put survivability over DPS. But here is where the interesting part comes in. The Murmillo is like a hybrid between the two. It's in between on almost every metric, and in some metrics it's even better, right? So here it's better, but I mean it's irrelevant, it's so small. But even when it falls off on the Berserk, so let's say in terms of damage, right, it's 6%. There's a 6% difference there. In terms of speed, 7%. But you see how, like, even when it's compared to the Berserk, it's not that far behind. In my opinion, the Murmillo is the first S tier unit. It's good in almost every situation. You have to be a little bit careful in terms of its pierce armor, but overall it's going to do so well versus almost every unit. And that's why I put the Murmillo as the first unit to enter our S tier category. Okay. Now the Hoplite, I would pick over the Berserk, and the Berserk I'd put in B. Now the Berserk is interesting because you have a lot of unique technologies which I didn't get into in this video. In a lot of scenarios, the Berserk is really, really good to add in. It has great DPS, right? The only thing with the Berserk is it's a hard unit to mix in. If you have high HP units that are going to take the brunt of the force of your opponent, the Berserk, if you mix a few of them in, it does really, really well. But it's a hard unit to make work. And also another cool thing about the Berserk is if you look at it, it has only a 9-second training time, which is really good. Most units are looking at 10. I think the Hoplite is 12 seconds. Let's take a look at what the Murmillo is. The Murmillo is 14 seconds. So there's a lot of use cases for the Berserk, and that can push it to A or even S. But in a general game where when you're just A moving into your opponent, and you're not using him situationally in the correct ways, I would say he's more of a B tier unit. Hoplite, you can use him in almost most situations, and you don't need to micromanage him. He's going to be good on the front lines, period, right? And the Murmillo, I think the Murmillo is just a beast. Like, think about this for a second. The Murmillo would probably beat almost every unit on this tier list except for the anti-infantry units. And even versus the anti-infantry units with like Shockwave or with Caladria, he can do very well. But essentially he would dominate this ranking. Even versus these two killer units, which we're going to go into right now. Alright guys, so now we're going to talk about the final two units, which are going to be the Fanatic, which is the Atlantean Age 4 special unit, and the Myrmidon, which is the Greek equivalent to the Fanatic, which is a special unit as well. Now this is going to be the part that I really enjoyed this part the most out of all of them, because I was actually curious. Now these ones operate very differently. Like this is a cool unit. Like these are really cool units, because here you can see that the DPS on a Myrmidon is really low compared to a Fanatic, but it has divine damage. Whereas the Fanatic has a bonus for infantry and cavalry. So on first glance, you'll think, okay, the Myrmidon is good versus everything, but the Fanatic is very good on the front lines because they can tear through cavalry and infantry. However, from my testing, they kind of performed similarly on the front lines as well. In terms of HP, the Fanatic wins, right? It has this right here. In terms of armor, slightly in the favor of the Myrmidon, but nothing too crazy here. There's only two things that really matter in this case, which is how does this perform? How does the DPS on the Myrmidon compare to the Fanatic on a front line? Okay, so we're going to delve into that a little bit. The HP is kind of in the Fanatic's favor at this point, but we're also going to have to see it in context. Alright guys, so I have two groups of units here fighting simultaneously, which is the Fanatics on the left hand side. There's 14 Fanatics. And there's 15 Myrmidon. I did the cost. It's roughly the same cost of both armies. Now, these units are not going to beat these armies because you have a Toxicate backline, which is going to shred them. Let's see who performs better. So let's have a look. And just before I do that, let me just turn the audio off so it's not conflicting with my voice. Okay, so let's have a look. I've already looked at this. I've looked at it about 5 or 6 times. And the tests, they performed roughly the same each time. You can see that the Fanatics have already gone through the front line, and now they're going to be focusing on the back line here. And so have the Myrmidon right now. So you can kind of see it's kind of close, it's kind of similar. Not a major difference between the two. Now, you have Toxitates in there. So let's see, assuming that there's no Toxicate, let's just see who shreds an opponent's melee front line faster. Okay, so you have Fanatics here. You have Myrmidon here, same amount of units. Let's see who wins in this scenario. Okay, in the previous scenario, you guys saw that it was roughly the same. Let's see how many more Myrmilor are left over in this situation. Alright, so Fanatics are almost done. Myrmidon are doing pretty well as well. Remember, there's one extra Myrmidon because of the cost differential between the two. And you can see that the Fanatics finished out faster than the Myrmidon, right? And the Fanatics, you have 7 remaining, whereas on the Myrmidon you have 5. These guys started off with 14, these guys started off with 5. Okay? So, I think there's a clear winner here. They both do very well on they're good units overall, but which one is better? And I think the differential here, the HP differential actually came in handy here, right? Having an extra 20 HP, an extra 8% HP per cost. On top of that, having a 2x multiplier versus infantry and cavalry, I think sealed the deal with, and I think Fanatics are significantly better than Myrmidon. I think the Fanatic is also an S tier unit because this one is instrumental. It can change the course of the game. You have 20 Fanatics out. What is your opponent going to use to counter that? The only thing you can really use, you can't use infantry. Like it's hard to use any type of infantry or cavalry front line versus these units. That's what makes it hard. So if we're going back to the tier list, in my opinion, I'm going to put the Myrmidon in A, and I'm going to put the Fanatic in S. Okay, so that is essentially my tier list. Alright guys, so that leads me to the end of the tier list. I hope you guys enjoyed it, and let me know if you guys disagree, if you think that, you know, things should have been ordered differently. I think a lot of comments in the past have had really, really good points, and I enjoy reading everything there. So yeah, let me know your thoughts. I'm also thinking about doing a community Discord where we can all get together, talk about the game and help one another. Obviously, I'm not sure how much time I'm going to have to actually be able to communicate there with my life the way it is right now. But I think if we can all gather in one spot, others can help others, and we can all benefit from it as well as a whole. So let me know if you guys think that's a good idea and if you would want to join at that point. Alright guys, I'll see you guys in the next one. Take care. See you later.